Hi. So we are back talking about how to deal with people. And so you've all should have watched our video case studies, which I'm titling Neighbors at Conflict, about Josh and Bert's conflict over the rose bush and their subsequent mediation session, which is very interesting. I mean, of course, this is in the workplace setting, but I think it really highlights how conflicts can play out, how there's a lot of different ways to go about it, how there's lots of different sources, and simple conflicts seem like it can be a little bit more complex than what they seem on the surface. I mean, certainly that's the case here, right? Where this is ostensibly about a conflict over a rose bush, but it's not really about that, right? It's really about Bert's feelings about Josh being his neighbor, Bert's feelings about displacement in his life, Josh's stress in his own work, and then really all that kind of boils over into this conflict over a rose bush, which really could have been solved by a lot of different ways if they were both proactive from the beginning. This also could have really perpetuated itself into a much more negative conflict, a much more aggressive conflict. And gotten much worse. So, to say the least, this is interesting and it highlights some both positive and negative things about conflict. And so, as part of your case study paper, so the first things that I want you to think about is take this case from both Josh and Bert's perspective, and think about like what are the sources of the conflict. What has motivated Bert to go bang on Josh's door? What has motivated Bert to be so upset about this rose bush? What has motivated Josh in the same place? How have their own actions contributed to this, and how have factors outside of this conflict contributed? Right. So I mean, certainly Bert losing both his wife and his long term friend and neighbor certainly adds some context to how his behavior is, and so maybe bang on his door seems like he's just aggressive and kind of a lunatic. When you start putting this perspective, maybe you start understanding and empathizing with him a little bit more. Um, and then, the other thing is I also want you to think about how they could have both acted a little differently here, and really kind of mitigated this conflict from the beginning. So how maybe Bert could have expressed his feelings early on. Maybe Josh could have introduced themselves and made friends with Bert when he first moved in, both of which might have mitigated some of this and stopped it from getting farther. You can also think about this in the other way, which is what could have they done to make this worse? And certainly, Josh could have escalated this conflict when Bert came and banged on his door. He could have, made this get physical. He could have yelled back. He could have called the police. Right? Bert could have again taken this to next levels, and this could have been a conflict over a rose bush that honestly could have changed the trajectory of both of their lives in negative ways. Um, so after we kind of think through the perspective, or you think this perspective of both Josh and Bert, I think the next kind of move is to start thinking about the perspective from the perspectives of the mediators. What advice would you give them? Right. So not so kind of change your role from being someone who's directly involved in this conflict to somebody who is trying to help these two manage this conflict. So what advice would you give them? What action steps can they take? Do you think this relationship between Josh and Bert is salvageable? And when I mean salvageable, I mean, can they move forward? What does this look like? Can they eventually become friends, or is this something that is irreparable damage? And that's always something to kind of consider when we come to conflicts, which is what is a path forward? What does that look like? And I think in this case, in my opinion, I think there is a path forward for these two if they both want it. But that's also kind of difficult to think of or ask the question of do they want it? Do they want to move forward? Um, Also think about whether or not you think the mediators in this case did a good job and what you would have done differently. How could you have played a more active role in this, right? Because I mean, certainly part of your role in a workplace and how you deal with people isn't just about managing conflicts that you're directly involved in. It's also about helping others manage their conflicts and getting to that part where we turn these kind of things into a positive spin, right? We come out with something good out of this. And so certainly I would call it a win-win situation if Josh and Bert get in this fight over a rose bush, but ultimately they turn out to be friends. They turn out to actually building a positive relationship that benefits both of them to a certain extent. But I mean, there's ways that this could have again turned negatively. Like they could have long-term grudges. It could honestly create more stress in their lives. I mean, imagine how difficult it is to go home every day and essentially have a neighbor that you're in conflict with, that you're trying to avoid. Like, I mean, that just adds some levels of difficulty and stress that neither of them probably need in their lives. But these are all kind of things to think about as we can kind of consider the broader aspect of this, which is like, how do we deal with conflict? And so I want you to think through this case, and kind of applying some of the things that we've talked about in topic one, but namely getting at that trying to identify those two big kind of steps that we talked about in the first video lecture, which is one, what is actually the problem here? What are the sources of conflict? And two, what are the resolutions, or what are the potential resolutions? Like, what can we do once we understand the conflict? And so if we can get to those two things, ultimately, we can probably discover an equitable solution, something that highlights the positive aspects and mitigates the negative aspects, which is ultimately our goal in conflict management.